Boundaries aren't just about saying no. They're really about defining how you work, like what you will and won't do. This is not really a communications problem, like it's not, or even a clarity problem. This is an enforcement problem. A good boundary is one where only your action needs to change. You're making the invisible visible. Okay. Instead of using emotion, you're using visibility. If you don't define your boundaries, the environment is going to define them for you. This is episode 442 of the Brilliant Balance podcast. And today we're talking about setting boundaries that actually hold. I'm answering listener questions, which is a little twist on our normal format. So welcome back to the Brilliant Balance show. I'm so glad you decided to tune in today. One last time before I get into our content for today, I want to take just a second to remind you about the workshop that Kate Northrup is hosting. It's going on this week, and I don't want you to miss it because we had Kate on the show 2 weeks ago. So postscript, if you have not listened to the episode with Kate, maybe go back and take a listen to that one. She talked about becoming good with money. And I know that this is a subject that is on so many of your hearts and minds and just takes up a lot of headspace. And so I think giving yourself a chance to just sit in the guidance of someone who has made this their life's work can be really important. Kate takes a very particular approach to how to manage money. She actually connects it to nervous system regulation, which I think is intriguing and really unique. And if this is an area of your life that is causing a lot of stress or concern, I want to make sure that you get some support. And Kate is definitely a pro who can do that. So the link to register for that workshop is totally free, by the way, is in the show notes of this episode. And also remember, take a listen to the interview that I did with her a couple weeks ago if you haven't had a chance to do that yet. But today, what I want to talk about is boundaries. And I did an episode on boundaries a few weeks ago, probably like over a month ago at this point. And I posted a few things on social about it and got some DMs about specific boundaries issues. And I love it when people do this, when they actually send a question or ask for an insight. And it's hard to do. It's hard to handle these over social sometimes. I just don't have a lot of capacity to do it. But I thought there were enough questions that came in on that area that it made it very clear to me that this is like a hot button issue for women. And I think it will be right till the end of time. And I think there are some really unique angles in these questions that came in that I thought, let's just do a roundup and we'll answer these. So we actually asked our community for a couple of extra ones, the coaching community, the women that I work with every day, and got to this set of 5 questions that I think are distinctive from one another, but will sort of take different angles on the issue of boundaries, particularly in a professional setting. Okay. So the questions that I'm going to go through today all look a little bit different on the surface. The people are in different roles. There's different companies involved. There's different specific situations, but underneath it, there is this theme around how do we actually hold boundaries, right? When it's hard, when there's a power dynamic at play, for example, or when saying no doesn't even feel like it's an option, or when you're the new person in the company or in the organization, or when you've kind of conditioned people that you don't hold boundaries and now you don't know what to do about that. So these 5 questions are organized into kind of boundary challenges, if you will. And here's what I want you to hear. Boundaries aren't just about saying no. They're really about defining how you work, like what you will and won't do. And different situations are actually going to require different strategies. So as you listen to this episode, I want you to notice which one of these patterns do you find yourself in, right? Which one feels the most familiar to you right now? And maybe what can you learn from these listener questions that you can apply to your own life? All right. So the first one up is boundaries that have a power imbalance. And the way she worded it was, how do you set boundaries with senior leaders who ignore your preferences? Like they call your personal phone after hours. I'm sure this is relatable to somebody listening today. And I think this one is tricky because it's not just about behavior. right? It's actually about hierarchy. This is one where the power imbalance is the challenge. And I think a lot of women, especially grown up good girls, right, which I always put myself in that category, chronic high performers, they default to thinking, well, they're the boss, right? The respect for authority sort of wins out over the boundary, and it becomes harder to hold the boundary because of that. And the boundary shift starts to feel optional. So, what I want you to do is think about this one as this is not really a communications problem, like it's not, or even a clarity problem. This is an enforcement problem, right? How am I going to enforce a boundary with somebody who outranks me? Because you've likely already stated your preference, right? You've probably told them what you want. But what hasn't happened is we haven't made it easier for them to honor it than it is for them to ignore it. And when you're dealing with a power imbalance, that's actually the key, right? You have to make it like the default where it's actually easier for them to honor your boundary than it is for them to blow right past it. I had once, she was a senior leader, really top performer. And she had a CEO. She reported to the CEO who would text her constantly at night. He was always traveling, always on the road, right? Different time zones. And she was getting these late night texts. And she had told him multiple times that evenings are tough, right? She's with her family. She had young children. And of course, he would be like, I get it. But then text her again the next night and the next night. So what we had to do was change the strategy. Instead of just repeating the request, like over and over again, hey, evenings are tough, right? I'm with my family. Could you not text me? She changed how she responded to the texts. So you can imagine she was in a pattern of like, well, shoot, he texted me again. I guess I'm going to respond again. And that's the pattern we actually had to break. So this is like kind of a reinforcement that a good boundary is one where only your action needs to change. So the boundary that she was able to hold was around responding to the text, right? She couldn't get him to hold the boundary around not sending it. That's not actually how boundaries work. They work by your behavior. So she stopped replying at night. And the next morning, she would respond via email, which was the preferred mode of communication. And she'd say, hey, just picking this up. Email's the best way to reach me, right? No drama, no lecture. She just responded via email in the morning. And over time, what happened is he started sending the things in emails, often waiting and kind of sending a few things at once in the morning, or saying to her, hey, I'm going to drop these here while I'm thinking about it. You can respond tomorrow. And then she would sort of collect herself and be able to respond in the morning. Over time, it broke the behavior. Okay. And I think the coaching point here is when there is a power dynamic at play, you can't really over explain or over negotiate. You sort of have to train the behavior that you want through your consistent action. What you do, the boundary is what you consistently reinforce. And by the way, emphasis on the consistent. If you are inconsistent about this and you violate your own boundary, people will not recognize that you are in fact trying to hold one. And they will think, oh, she doesn't really mean that. And then an inch becomes a mile. Okay, so that's the first little vignette I wanted to get into today is the power dynamic vignette. And I think it's one that's really, really prevalent. Okay, the second coaching question here that came in, what do you do when you can't turn down more work, but it's becoming unmanageable? And I read this one a couple of times because I kept getting stuck on the word can't, right? When you just can't turn down the work. I'm such a believer that everything is, what would have to be true for you to turn down the work? But if I take her at her word and it's like, listen, what I'm hearing is based on the culture in the company or my position in the company, I just can't turn this down. I think what often is happening here is that inner narrative is like, if I can't make myself say no to this, or if I don't have the power to say no to this, then I can't hold a boundary. And that's the part that I want to challenge. Okay. Maybe you generally cannot control the volume of work coming at you. You can't turn it down. It's coming. There probably are places where you do have control, like the priority that you place on that new project, the pace with which you commit to doing it, right? The standard of excellence that you do it to. Any of those things might actually be the place where you have a degree of freedom, right? So imagine you're in a place where your boss just keeps piling things on, like this person asking the question. And let's assume you genuinely cannot say no. It's just not that kind of environment, but you're drowning. Instead of pushing back, like with emotion as the driver saying, I just can't, which makes us feel like a failure, right? Or feel weak or feel vulnerable. What you might say instead is, hey, I'm happy to take that on. Can you help me understand where it fits relative to like X, Y, and Z that are already on your work plan, right? So what are you doing here? You're making the invisible visible. Okay. Instead of using emotion, you're using visibility. You're saying, you're sort of implying you may not actually understand how many things I'm already doing, what I'm already working on. So let me put it all in front of you and you tell me where you think this is going to fit. Right. So I think this is so common for individuals to assume that their leaders are aware of their current workload, how overloaded they are at any point in time, and like sort of what their total capacity is to bear more. And I'm going to argue they're just not, right? They're not mind readers. And I think collectively, we don't do a great job of laying visible like the level of work that we're being asked to do. So this strategy of making it visible, and by the way, making the trade-offs visible, right? You're no longer refusing. You're not saying, I can't do this. You're just saying, where do you want me to fit this in? What trade-offs are you, the leader, willing to make so that I can get this done? And guess what happens? Your boss will start reprioritizing, right? I do it for the organization that I lead. When people come to me and say, where does this fit relative to X and Y? I instinctively reprioritize. Sometimes my new request does in fact go to the top of the pile and other things get displaced. And sometimes it's the like reality check that I need to say, oh, you know what? Just kidding, right? Maybe that one doesn't go to the top of the pile. Actually, let's get that in next week or the week after. So I think when it's visible, it's easier to decide as a leader what can wait and what can't. And so if you don't feel like you have the power to do that from your seat in the org chart, you may be able to get your leaders buy into it, right? You don't need permission to stop pretending that everything fits, right? Sometimes a boundary is just about forcing that clarity or forcing that visibility rather than outright refusing it. Okay. So that's the first two that we've been through in terms of these questions. And you can just see how powerful this is to have real examples from real listeners to work with. This is it. I'm having like flashbacks because this is what coaching feels like when I work with clients inside of our coaching community and we're workshopping questions like this every day. It is, this is reminiscent of how that feels. So the third question is about this is how it's written. How do you handle colleagues who constantly reach out after hours? Now, I want you to notice this sounds similar to the first question, okay, which was about the boss. But this is colleagues. And I think because of that, the strategy is a little bit different, right? This one feels like you're under attack. If multiple people are doing this, kind of everyone is communicating after hours, you've signed off for the day or for the time being, and people are still continuing to hit you via all the communication channels. Like, what do you do? And I think what this illustrates is the unspoken norm that exists in some companies that like we're always on. Right? We are tapped in 24/7. We are always open for business. We will respond to things kind of around the clock. If that's the cultural norm, you're not going to fix that with one kind of awkward conversation, right? You fix that by resetting expectations and sort of leading by example, starting with your own behavior. And sometimes this is a place where you have to harness the power of influence. If you don't have positional power to actually change the dynamic of how people operate or to say, hey, we're not going to be responding to emails in the evenings anymore. Sometimes you have to use influence here. And so I do think a conversation with your peer group around the expectations of response time when things are sent after hours can be very practical. You can do this within a peer group, even if you're not the de facto leader of that organization. But you can start with your own behavior, just like responding the next morning, like we did in the example with the boss, or responding immediately saying, hey, I'll take a look at this first thing tomorrow. I'm tied up right now. Or even softer than that, just, hey, is this urgent? If it's not, I'll get to it tomorrow, right? Like you can kind of step your way down with peers. But at some point, a conversation where collectively you guys say, is this working for us? Right? Do we want to be people who are in this norm of working around the clock? Or do we want to try having a few hours that are like a no-fly zone, right? when I was working at Procter and Gamble, I was working in laundry care at one point, which was a big category. There were a lot of people involved in that category across functions. And it was a global business. So the communications were intense. There was kind of a 24/7 culture that people would be emailing and texting all the time. And I remember having a conversation like this with my peer group of marketers saying, like, what can we do to reset the norms here a bit? And we did start with saving things in draft. I mean, this was so many years ago, but just the simple act of saving emails in draft and not sending them as soon as we had the thought, but then the next morning releasing those emails. And then we learned that actually wasn't that helpful because people were coming into a flood of email and a big to-do list of things to handle first thing in the morning. So we just reset the expectation, like you can send whatever you want at night, right? If you're in another time zone or if you are catching up in the evening and it just makes sense to you to kind of get it out of your inbox and handle your piece of it, knock yourself out. But don't expect a response, right? Because everyone is working on different schedules and different timelines. And so you can't assume that you're going to get an immediate response to something and be able to keep going if it is after hours. And so that was the really simple shift that worked for us as a team, was to say, it's always okay to send it, right? Just get it out of your inbox if that's a time that you're clearing things out. But you can't expect the response until kind of traditional business hours for whoever you sent it to. And, was it a perfect system? Imperfect for sure, but it really did make a difference. It put a dent in that kind of behavior where everyone felt like they had no room to breathe. Just that sentence around, hey, I might send things when it's convenient for me. That might be after hours, but I don't expect a response until your working hours. Really let everybody kind of chill. So you don't have to like fight the culture hardcore, but you do have to stop reinforcing parts of it that don't work for you and maybe leveraging influence to see where you can shift people's behavior. All right, let's tackle another one. This is related to starting a new role. And the question was really simple. How do you establish boundaries when you're brand new in your job? Okay, I love this question. This is one of my favorite ones to answer in coaching. And I think the phrase that I use all the time, anyone who has ever worked with me as a coach or an advisor knows this. My phrase is begin as you mean to go on, right? Begin as you mean to go on. I think we are addicted to proving ourselves. When we are new, we think, I got to get in there and show them what I can do. And I'm going to prove that I'm dedicated and committed. And we will break every boundary we ever held. We will change every behavior pattern to try to look really good in this new assignment for this new team or new boss. And it backfires every time. Because what happens is we're being very helpful. Everyone gets very addicted to our availability, and we accidentally set like an unsustainable pattern, right? We establish a pattern that we have no business trying to sustain. Instead, if we start with the boundaries we mean to hold, right? These are going to be my normal work hours. This is going to be the kind of response time you can expect from me. Am I going to work weekends or not, right? Am I working in the evenings to catch up or not? That first 30 to 60 days in a role, I need you to hear this because it is true. That is your window of opportunity. That is when boundaries are the easiest to establish because you are a brand new unknown entity to that group of people. And so the way you do things early on is the way they are going to come to expect them from you. Okay. So instead of immediately saying yes to everything, just adopting that mantra of begin as you mean to go on, right? Allows you to say like, all right, my plan is I'm going to get my kids off to school every day before I show up in the office. I had a boss who did this back again in my P&G days. She did not get in until between 9 and 9:30, which was really unusual in that culture. It was a very early bird culture. People would get in 7 or 8 and sometimes earlier. She was rolling in at 9:30 because she had very young school-age children, and it was a consistent time of day that she could be present and available to them. And she was like, I'm not doing meetings before that. You guys can figure it out. And it set such a mark in my mind when I watched her do that, because a lot of people were thinking about how do I get out of here on time, or how do I not do work in the evenings or weekends? But that idea of protecting morning space, she did it from day one in the role. And you know what? We didn't set 8 o'clock meetings. Like, we knew she wasn't going to be there until 9 or 9:30. And that was the first window that we were going to be able to consistently be on her calendar. So I think that is a great kind of example of really looking at your life and knowing what do you need to have as a boundary to be successful in that role over the long term, and then begin as you mean to go on and just reinforce that with consistency. Okay. Last one. This is the last listener question I'm going to cover here. And this is sort of about I think like the invisible load. The question is, how do you avoid taking on uncompensated work at work? Things like planning events or coordinating extras. Okay, this takes me right back to my days in the Southeast Women's Network when I was brand new in my corporate life. And I thought it was such a privilege and honor to be asked to participate in the leadership of that organization. And we were essentially planning events all the time, right? Like hosting conferences and lunches and social events for the women who were working in that southeastern region of the country in sales. And I loved doing it. But also at that time in my life, I had a ton of capacity, right? I was single. I was living alone. I had no kids, no pets, right? No one to take care of. And it was really pretty easy and fun for me to lean into something like that. Fast forward 10 years maybe in my career, I was still getting asked to do things like that. And I did not have the capacity, right? My life had become so much more complex by then. And there just wasn't room for me to take on like unpaid extracurricular work at work on top of my very big full-time job. And so I think this happens a lot. We get handed uncompensated work as though it's an honor being bestowed upon us, that we're being asked to do this extra cool thing. And this really, really matters, okay? Because it's not just about your time. It's really about the positioning of this. It's how it gets handed over as an expectation that not only will you do it, but you'll be grateful for it, right? And I think sometimes we become the people who are easy to ask, right? We're reliable, we're capable, we get a lot done. And so we become associated with work that is not necessarily visible or rewarded or strategic. There's just a lot of it. Okay. And you can have the classic examples like the person who's being asked on top of their responsibilities to lead the meeting to also like organize lunch for the meeting, right? Or to take notes in the meeting. You can think about those classic examples. Thank God for AI, right? Now none of us have to take notes in anything anymore. But those responsibilities are kind of the thankless responsibilities. The same thing I was describing with diversity networks, like the Women's Network being one of them and all the ERGs, those are often extra unpaid work. And if you can parlay that into a visibility opportunity where you're demonstrating leadership, right? Maybe you don't have the opportunity to lead in your current role, but you do have the opportunity to be a leader inside of a network, I think it can be valuable there. But if you keep getting asked to organize things that you're good at, but that are not helping your career, you want to learn the redirect. Okay. Here's what the redirect sounds like. I'm heads down on, insert priority project here, but I'm happy to help think through a quick plan if someone else can own the execution. Think about that. Okay. Happy to help think through a plan if someone else can own the execution. Critically important because the plan is a short sprint, right? I will go to a meeting with the person who's going to be in charge of executing and we'll game this thing out. I'll give them my ideas, I'll lend my experience, but at that point, I'm going to step aside and I'm going to have someone else be in charge of executing the steps this time. Huge compression of time and energy that's required, and you still have the opportunity to put a stamp on it to, support the person who asked you to do it, but not be the default owner. Okay. Every time we say yes to one of those opportunities that comes our way, it comes with like a default to ownership, whether you realize it or not. And if you don't protect your time, you'll get pulled into work that really dilutes your impact. So I think holding a boundary around this unpaid work looks like finding a way to add value, but limiting the amount of time and energy drain that it takes to execute. And also, sometimes it looks like just flat out saying no and trusting that it's not going to make you look bad. You're not going to look like you're not a team player. You can sort of leverage one of the other strategies we talked about earlier today and layer it in here, right? Like, hey, I'm happy to do that if we take something else off my plate. Let me show you what else I have going on, right? I'm tapped right now. My project load is full. And I think there is if you need a little bit of a permission slip here, there is almost always someone like 22-year-old me, right, who is looking for the opportunity to lead. And I said, when I started my career, those things were a delight to be asked to do. I thought it was fun. I got to be collaborative with other people. I got to practice some leadership skills. So if you are in the stage where you're tapped and it feels like a grind, there is probably somebody waiting in the wings who would love the opportunity to take that on. And that can sometimes help you find the emotional bandwidth to hand this one off. Okay. So if we step back for a second and look at all 5 of these situations, every one of these involved a boundary, right? But every one of them required a different approach. The first one we talked about, where we had the senior leader, really required an enforcement of a boundary that you could control. The reminder that the only kind of boundary that works is one where you have full control over the execution. So she had to think about her response. The second one required visibility, making the invisible visible, right? Like not expecting the person to be a mind reader, but showing them the trade-offs that they're about to force by asking you to do this thing. The third one, we looked at norm setting. How do you kind of reset the cultural norms? And we were talking about response time to emails. If you're dealing with a peer group and you're trying to shift the culture, how do we do some norm setting as a group so that you're not the only one? Like you're not out there on a limb flying solo. You're actually bringing everybody along with you. The fourth example, we talked about being proactive, like begin as you mean to go on, was being deliberate and proactive about you setting the expectations before they get set for you. And then in the last one, we're talking about role protection. How do you protect the integrity of your role, right? And be known for what you want to be known for, and then make sure that you're handing off the opportunities that are not actually connected to your role to other people. So this is what I want you to take with you. If you don't define your boundaries, the environment is going to define them for you. And it's not because people are like out to get you. It's because people will always take the maximum available to them. That is true at work, where all of these examples took place today, and it's also true at home. People will take the maximum available. So one of the questions for you to sit with is, where in life, at work, at home, have you sort of been hoping that people will adjust to a boundary that you want to hold, instead of clearly defining for them how you're going to operate? Like, in other words, where are you giving them the power over the boundary instead of taking it for yourself? And I want you to challenge yourself, like, what could I do? Next boundary, right? That's the next one that you want to go pay attention to. You are holding the cards. I want you to play them. And I want you to report back on how this went. Okay. This is a great place to DM me. I would love to hear from you. Instagram, I'm at CSchoolNikki. And it's such an easy place to just say, hey, listen to this episode and here's what I did. And I'd love to hear how it went. It was great to get these questions. And I think it could also be a great way to hear from you on things you're doing to apply what you are learning from the podcast. So thank you for being here today. I am so glad that you tuned in. Maybe share this episode with a friend or a colleague who you think is struggling with boundaries, or you've had conversations with about boundaries. And I bet they would learn a lot as well. That's all for today, my friends. Till next time. Let's be brilliant.